As we celebrate Christmas, it's very important for us to bring to mind the role Africa played in the Christian faith. And I know when I say that, a lot of us will start wondering, what role did we play in the Christian faith? I think it's very important for us to also remind ourselves or even get to know some of the very important facts about Africa and this season that we celebrate. Now, growing up, a lot of us, were taught in schools and in our churches that Africa got acquainted with the Christian faith through the missionaries. And a lot of African Christians have given up on their faith. I can't say the data, but I've met a couple of people that have said, you can't be African and also be a Christian because the Christian faith came from the missionaries who worked hand in hand with the slave masters. As much as there are layers to this truth, I think it's very important that we start from the beginning. And what is it? The beginning is the fact that Africa played a very major role in the early church long before the Europeans got acquainted with the Christian faith. And you heard me correctly. And you wonder how. Well, when the apostolic mission started, after the death, resurrection of Christ and the Pentecost, and then, Christ commissioned his apostles to go out and literally evangelize, what we call evangelism right now at this time of the Christian faith. It's important to know that Mark and Peter extended their apostolic missions in the earliest time after Christ's resurrection to Africa, precisely Ethiopia and Egypt, right? And in as much as growing up as well, we celebrated a white Christ, it's very important for us to realize that Christ is not European. Jesus Christ is not a tall white man. Jesus Christ is not the depiction of Jesus Christ we have seen in movies while growing up. Is not Christ. Is not the true depiction of Christ's biological history or heritage, right? Or his natural birth circumstance is not depicted in the movies that we have watched growing up. Jesus Christ had more Afro-Asian earthly experience. And in as much as we call Jesus Christ, we all know that his birth name is Yeshua. And Jesus Christ became his name after when the Bible was translated to English. Then the apostles were given, the English translations to their name, and so also as Jesus. Jesus' birth name is Yeshua. So that's just the major point here. Jesus Christ is not European. And also the African church got to know about Christ before the Europeans. Very important for us to know. Very important, and I'll tell you why. Now, this is not just about getting to know. The African church played a very major role during the growth of the Christian faith, because after Christ died and then the apostles, if you read the history of the church, you would see that it was so many things ongoing, the paths to where we're going. But the major part I want us to pay attention to is the fact that Africa played a major role. Alexandria was an intellectual powerhouse, Christian philosophical powerhouse in the early church, long before Europeans. That's one. Secondly, Ethiopia preserved 81 biblical canons. So you have the 66 books, you have the 70-something books from the Catholic Church, Good News Bible, and so many other Bibles have translated it. But the Ethiopian church has 81 canons, inclusive of the 66 and more. The New Testament has 27 books, and these books were reviewed and authorized as acceptable by the bishops in Alexandria, the intellectuals in Alexandria. You have the Saint Athanasius, you have Tertullian. These are powerhouse African intellectuals that first of all, collated and decided that these 27 books of the New Testament, these 27 books should make up the New Testament. Then we had other bishops, other councils, like the council in Hippo, that also agreed, right, that this formation is adequate, this formation should be authorized. And then it was also passed on to Rome. That's how deep the African church, that's how much of a deep role the African church played at the early times of the Christian faith, years before the Europeans got to know about Christianity. And the Ethiopian church as well. The Ethiopian church is one of the first Christian churches in the world, right? That's one as well. Also, Ethiopia is one of the first nations that legalized the Christian faith as a state religion. So when Christ was born and Rome was persecuting and whatnot, before they now, legalized, Constantine now recognized the Christian faith, and then they started the process to now, at some point through historical pathway, now finally accepted the Christian faith as a state religion. This was long after Ethiopia, long after Alexandria has done so much work in the Christian faith. I thought it was very important for us to know that. And I know what's going to pass through a lot of people's mind now is, so if that is the case, then what did the missionaries come to do in West Africa? So that's why I said this is in layers. In as much as the Christian faith and, the Africa played a very distinct role in the church. And West Africa, yes, did not necessarily, I can't really say for that, but did not necessarily know about the Christian faith. But we did also know that there was something called the Supreme God, right? We had Eledumare, Chukwu. So while we want to believe that Africa was in the dark till the missionaries came, that's not actually the case. That's not actually the case. Until the great divergence where Greece and Romans, had their own philosophy on what Christ should be defined as. And then you had the other Orthodox churches refusing to accept. It was just one wholesome early church with several centers, inclusive of an African center, Alexandria. Ethiopia was one of the first nations to accept the Christian faith as a state religion. The next train of thought is, if this is the case, then why did the missionaries come? So, the early church happened in North Africa, right? So the missionaries came with the policy to convert and also conquer. Another important aspect of our history that I would also like to clarify is the fact that a lot of Nigerians, now let's subsume to Nigeria, a lot of Nigerians believe that their ancestors betrayed them by selling, other Nigerians for slavery. In as much as that is true, not the betrayal part, but the fact that we sold slaves, it's important to know that it was a global phenomenon. It was happening in several other parts of the world. The Ottoman Empire, the Vikings, the ancient Greece, they all were involved in slave trade. But not the kind of slave trade that, was happening, not the transatlantic kind of slave trade. The kind of slave trade that was happening at that point was the selling of war captives, debtors, and the rest. And that's how it also was in Nigeria. So the first stage of this slave trade was the selling of war captives. And don't forget that just like there was nothing like the European Union, there was nothing like Africa, there was nothing like Nigeria, it was just kingdoms. So if a kingdom goes into a fight or a war with another kingdom and comes back with captives, those captives were regarded as slaves that could be sold. And that's how it was. As much as we want to say Nigerians are greedy, Africans are greedy, why were they selling themselves? That was a global phenomenon. It was the culture of that time, of that century. Now, after the first stage of selling captives in Nigeria for metal, guns, and whiskey and the rest, it moved into a second stage. But before we get into that, I would like to push back a bit to also inform us that the first that Africa also conquered Europe 700 years before Europeans came to Africa. Africa had already conquered Europe. Precisely, I think the first location was Spain. And the Africans that did that were called the Moors, Arabs and Muslim Africans actually. And they did not they went to Europe, they developed technology, universities, roads, they developed Spain with their science. They taught them algebra, they taught them mathematics, they taught them zero, the number zero. They taught them cosmology, they taught them, the science of the sheep, compass. Enormous information came from Africa to Europe. It was not, no one ruled the way, the slave trade in Nigeria between Europeans and Nigeria evolved to. Within 10 to 15 years after they were able to push out the Moors, after 700 years of Africans ruling them, they now came to Africa. So a lot of the technology they came with, a lot of it was also bettered by Africans and shared shared by Africans to them. I think this is also very important to know, because when you think of Africa as a continent that was enslaved or that was conquered, and you don't think of Africa as a continent that also conquered their counterparts, you might not get the full picture of Africa. When Africa had left Europe, there was this set of people, Barbary pirates, that still went to Europe. And, while Europe had come to Africa, some Africans were also in Europe, also buying and selling slaves for another 300 years until the French came to, that part of Africa, and then now literally conquered them, stopped the ports, stopped the coast, to stop the pirates from going into the ocean to capture and sell. I also think that it's very important for us to know that before the transatlantic slave trade was not an issue of race. It was an issue of social class and social status. So the rich would never be slaves. People from a low social class, or people that work captives, like I've said, debtors, like I've said, from every culture. The characteristics of what slave trade was, global slave trade was, in that century, and what the Europeans came and did in Africa was totally opposite. Number one, Africa also sold slaves from other continents, inclusive of Europe. Number two, Africa also conquered Europe 700 years before Europe came to Nigeria and shared a lot of their science with Europe. They were way ahead. They were the first world. What we call first world, when we say the first world is the West, Africa was the first world then, because Europe was in darkness. Very important for us to know this. Very important for us to know this. So as we celebrate Christmas and celebrate the birth of a king, the King, Christ, I think we should bring to mind the fact that we must rebirth our minds from the mental slavery that a lot of us are running with, inclusive of myself. We have a lot of narratives that are not true about Africa. We have a lot of narratives that are not true about our country, Nigeria. And I hope I've been able to debunk some of them. In as much as I understand that relocating is very important in a global society, people would move from here to there. Recently, there was a visa ban by the US to Nigerians. And it just brought to mind the fact that if you don't have a well thought out plan for your reason for Japan, it might not be the best solution. And if we remain reluctant and complacent, we are not necessarily celebrating Christ in his fullest essence, because Christ was a disruptor. And we have to disrupt the status quo in Nigeria. And then some people would say, oh, Nigeria is not our country. We are given that name by the slave masters. We are not migrants in Nigeria. We were not brought to Nigeria. The Benin Kingdom had a world wonder. The Benin Walls had more. The Benin Walls is one of the greatest wonders of the world. Used more soil for its creation than the great Egyptian pyramids. Is regarded as a more superior structure to the Chinese wall, not just even leave Berlin, right? People celebrate their culture. And the people that built these walls were not slaves. It took them thousands of years to build those walls that the British burnt down. A lot of our culture, a lot of our history was taken away from us. It's a vacuum of who we are and what we can become. Again, we are not trying to become what we were not, what we can become again. So when people say we're not Nigerians, well, if you're from Benin, your ancestors grew up in Benin. If you're from Oyo Empire, your ancestors grew up in Oyo Empire. Same as the Eastern kingdoms, the Northern kingdoms. We are not migrants. We did not evolve, come into Nigeria. This is our soil. Let's not get distracted. This is where our forefathers were. And we go to some places like Badagry, we see what slave trade represented. And I've already said that slave trade did not come to Nigeria because of greed. Slave trade was a global phenomenon of that century. Our forefathers were not greedy as the reason why there was slave trade. Now, when they started trading guns, so let's assume Kingdom A and Kingdom B did not know each other. It's not one Nigeria. They are at war with each other. Like, they can literally be at war with each other, not that they are at war. It can happen that something will come up and they'll be at war with each other. So by these Europeans selling guns to Kingdom A, Kingdom B would want the gun too, so that they don't lose out. And that's how this whole war phenomenon created the need for more guns. So it was a vicious cycle. That was one reason why this slave trade now became desperate venture of our people trading for guns with the Europeans, right? Because the more they had, the more there was more war and fighting, the more you needed more guns. It was a vicious cycle. But from the European point of view, they now got to the Americans. The same year that the Moors left Europe after 700 years, the same year that the last batch in Grenada in Spain left Europe, was the same year that Columbus found the Americas. You will tell me it's not the technology of Africa? You will tell me it's not the technology of Africa? Now, when Columbus found the Americas, they started, they had, obviously, Europeans went to the Americas and stayed with the indigenous people of America, but they were definitely outnumbered. At some point, when they started bringing Africans in, Africa, it was a ratio of 10-1. So 10 Africans to 1 European. But before they started bringing Africans in, when they have trade, the period when they were doing the slave trade, the entrance of selling guns for war captives and debtors came, it was still controlled by the African kingdom, by the Nigeria. It was still controlled. They were not bothered because these Africans were not even taken out of Africa. They were there, right there, working for the Europeans, right there in the African soil. Then when this war started from the exchange of the weaponry coming in, it started increasing. And so some of them started relocating with their slaves to their own country. That's the second stage. To their own continent. That's the second stage. But now by the third stage, there was some disease that came to the Americas and wiped out almost 90% of the indigenous Americans. And the plantations were already coming up. They needed more hands. The Europeans needed more hands. So that's when the desperate times of bringing in, that's when this slave trade that now became inhuman. It was not an inhuman. Not that, slaves were treated like free citizens, but it was not as inhuman as it was. Like I already mentioned, they were allowed to marry, they were allowed to have, to get trained, do their business. They were allowed to, their children did not necessarily have to be slave trade. They were also allowed to buy themselves out of slavery. So, but when the indigenous Indians, a lot of them died, and these Europeans needed more hands for their growing businesses, plantations and the rest, they now realized, we can get labor from Africa. And then we bring them in, and they are way more than us, because Europeans were not a lot then in Americas, because we know they migrated there. They now needed to enforce laws to make sure that Africans do not, rebel, especially because they were outnumbered. That's why it became very inhuman. And that's not an excuse for what Africans went through. But there's an irony to the fact that we went through all that with our rich heritage, and a lot of us are traveling with no plan whatsoever. There's a paradox there, which I cannot judge because I can't play God. But what I'm saying is, as we are celebrating Christmas, it's important for us to have a rebirth in our minds, as we're celebrating the birth of Christ, we must on one other hand have the rebirth of our mind. Random ideologies that have not been checked should not be accepted in our minds going forward. We are not second-class citizens. We are first-class citizens of the world. Nigeria, whether it's called Nigeria because of colonialism or not, this is our soil. We are not migrants. This is where our ancestors lived. We are not migrants. We were not pulled in from different nations to this soil now called Nigeria and, colonized, right? So we have to take ourselves a bit more seriously. We have to be disruptors of the mind and of the possibilities of creating a first world nation. We have to have the right will, the national will, the citizens' will. People have said that leadership is our problem. And, my previous episode, I mentioned 4 leaderships and the importance of the 4 leaderships. And these 4 leaderships are within the citizenry. They are not from some other planet. Within the citizenry are where these leaders are from. And that means you and I. Also, when people complain about the government, it's like, this government, I want us to bring to mind that this government, the term government does not mean, it's not an abstraction. These are human beings. These are Nigerians that probably did some form of schooling in Nigeria, attend some form of religious space, attend social gatherings. So what I'm trying to say is that they are human beings within our circle. Perhaps not necessarily approachable by every one of us, but definitely approachable by a lot of us. So we need to start demanding. We need to start not only demanding, we need to also start suggesting, collaborating, negotiating for a better Nigeria. I spoke also from my previous episode about the importance of social structure, social security, the importance of the national will of the people. And I think we can start the conversation from here. We remain defeated when we think that development is beyond us, when we wear defeatism, when we approach complex situations by shutting down, when we think the only way forward is to collaborate with the negatives or the challenges that are hindering our development. If you ask, how can I participate in the development of Nigeria from where I am right now? I would say collaborate. The key word is collaboration. It's Yeshua's season of, birthday celebration. And we must rebirth our minds for a prosperous Nigeria, because we can become a first world nation when we put in the required collaboration and participation.